It all started with a screech. Not the sound of tires or brakes, but the sharp, unmistakable shrill of a woman who had perfected the art of complaining. The kind of voice that made your spine stiffen before you even registered the words. "Excuse me. Excuse me." I turned, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, and there she was, arms crossed, foot tapping, face twisted into an expression of pure, unfiltered rage. Karen. I didn't know her name yet, but the haircut, the expensive yet aggressively tasteless outfit, and the sheer aura of entitlement told me everything I needed to know. "You can't park that here," she snapped, jabbing a manicured finger at my driveway. I looked at my car, my police cruiser, then back at her. "Pretty sure I can," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "No, actually you can't. This is an HOA neighborhood, and official vehicles aren't allowed overnight. It's disruptive to the community aesthetic." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Funny," I said, "because I read my property deed before I moved in. My house isn't in the HOA. That should have been the end of it. Normal people, reasonable people, would have taken the L and walked away. But Karen wasn't normal. Karen thrived on control. And the fact that I was standing there, not immediately bowing to her absurd demand, was making her twitch. Her lips pursed. "Well," she huffed, "you're still part of this community, and we have certain standards." "Right," I said. "And I have certain rights. One of them is parking in my own driveway." Her face went red. "This is exactly why we need to bring this property under HOA jurisdiction," she muttered, shaking her head like I was some stray animal ruining the neighborhood's charm. I nearly laughed. "Good luck with that," I said, giving her a casual salute before heading inside. That should have been the end of it. But for Karen, that was just the beginning. The letters started appearing first. Slipped under my door, stuffed into my mailbox, left on my windshield. Each one had the same theme. "Dear homeowner, we noticed your property does not align with the community's visual harmony. Please consider the following changes for compliance." They were all signed Karen Whitmore, HOA President. I ignored them. Then came the emails. More aggressive this time. "We have received multiple complaints regarding your police vehicle disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of Fairview Estates." Right. Multiple complaints. As in Karen complaining to herself. I ignored those too. Then came the fines. Fake HOA violation notices printed on official-looking letterhead, left taped to my door. $50 for an unapproved mailbox. $100 for excessive vehicle presence. $200 for non-compliance. I laughed. She had no legal authority over me. That's when she lost it. One morning, I stepped outside to find Karen waiting in my driveway, hands on her hips, like she was about to lay down the law. "This is your final warning," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Or what?" She clenched her jaw. Then she did something so mind-blowingly stupid, I almost couldn't believe it. She pulled out her phone and called 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" Karen's voice sharpened like a dagger. "There's a dangerous trespasser in my neighborhood." A beat of silence. The dispatcher's tone immediately turned serious. "Can you describe the suspect?" "Yes," Karen snapped. "He's a man standing in my driveway." Another pause. This one longer. "You mean, your driveway?" "No, but it should be mine." The dispatcher, to their credit, did not immediately hang up. But I could hear the struggle in their voice as they tried to process the sheer stupidity of the situation. "Ma'am, is this person threatening you?" "He's refusing to leave." The dispatcher took another deep breath. "And is he armed?" "He's a cop." Silence. Then, click. The dispatcher had just hung up on her. I folded my arms and grinned. Well, that was embarrassing. Karen's face twitched. They must have lost connection. Right, I said. Or maybe they realized you just called 911 on a police officer. Her lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. But she wasn't about to back down. Oh no, Karen wasn't done. She jabbed a finger at me. Fine. If the police won't do their job, I'll handle this myself. And with that, she stormed off. A normal person would take the loss. A normal person would realize they had just made a complete fool of themselves. But Karen wasn't normal. She was about to make things so much worse for herself. I went inside, shaking my head, and poured myself another cup of coffee. Then, my police scanner crackled to life. Suspicious trespasser reported at Fairview Estates. Responding units en route. I nearly choked. She actually did it. She actually called again. Sirens. I heard them before I saw them. 2 patrol cars rolled up in front of my house, red and blue flashing. Karen came bounding out of her house like a lunatic, arms flailing, so excited to watch me get dragged away in cuffs. There, she screeched, pointing like she was identifying a murder suspect. Arrest that man. The officers stepped out. They looked at me. Then, recognition dawned. One of them actually burst out laughing. Wait, the officer said, turning back to Karen, trying to keep a straight face. You're saying he's the trespasser? Karen nodded furiously. The officer turned back to me. Carter, he said, barely containing his grin. This lady just called 911 on you. I nodded. Karen, oblivious to how badly she had just played herself, kept going. I don't care if he's a janitor or the mayor. He's trespassing. He's illegally parked in my HOA's jurisdiction. The second officer rubbed his temples. Ma'am, he said slowly, this isn't an HOA property. It should be. Right, the first officer sighed. Ma'am, you can't just call 911 because you don't like someone's car in their own driveway. Karen gasped like she had just been personally insulted. Are you refusing to uphold the law? The second officer shook his head. No, but you did just file a false police report, and that is a crime. Karen's face went pale. What? I pulled out my phone and started recording. Don't worry, Karen, I said. This is all on video. You called 911 on a cop for parking in his own driveway. Her eyes darted around. Neighbors were watching. Windows cracked open. Curtains shifted. People were whispering. For the first time since I met her, Karen hesitated. But instead of backing down, she did what Karens do best. She doubled down. And that was her biggest mistake. Karen stormed off that day, but if I thought she had learned her lesson, I was sorely mistaken. In fact, that ridiculous 911 call was just the opening act of what would become the most unhinged HOA battle of all time. Because Karen, she wasn't just petty, she was obsessive. And if she couldn't get the police to drag me out of my own driveway, she was going to take matters into her own hands. The next morning, I woke up to find something taped to my garage door. A letter. No, a violation notice. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your vehicle is in violation of community regulations. Unapproved commercial vehicles are strictly prohibited from being stored on residential property overnight. Please remove the vehicle immediately to avoid penalties. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $250 per day. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. I laughed. Actually, out loud. First off, my property wasn't even part of the HOA. Second, she still had no legal authority over me. Third, was she really going to try and fine a cop? I crumpled up the notice and tossed it in the trash. But when I walked back inside, my email inbox exploded. Karen had mobilized the HOA minions. Email after email from concerned residents complaining about how my police cruiser was a threat to the neighborhood. Some of my favorites included: the presence of law enforcement vehicles decreases property values. Your car makes the area feel unsafe for children. This is a family community, not a police station. I had to sit down for that last one. They were literally saying that having a police car nearby made them feel unsafe. Right. I ignored the emails. But then came the letters. They started appearing under my door, in my mailbox, even wedged into my windshield wipers. Each one had some variation of, "We don't feel comfortable with your presence." The HOA has standards, and we expect all residents to comply. Your behavior is disrupting the harmony of Fairview Estates. There was only one problem. None of them were signed. Anonymous complaints. No names. No accountability. Because Karen might have been bold enough to pick this fight, but she sure as hell wasn't brave enough to put her own name on these ridiculous threats. So I did what I do best. Nothing. I let her dig her own grave. And sure enough, within 3 days, she escalated. It started small. I walked outside one morning and noticed trash scattered near my driveway. Random bits of paper, empty soda cans, coffee cups, placed just close enough to make my property look messy. At first I thought maybe it was just wind. But the next day, it happened again. Then, someone started cracking eggshells near my tires. That's when I knew this was intentional. But the real kicker? The giant red HOA violation sticker someone had slapped across my garage door. It was printed, professionally made. That meant Karen had planned this. She had gone out of her way to have an oversized sticker designed specifically to harass me. She was playing games. So, I pulled out my security footage. And surprise, surprise, guess who it caught at 2 a.m., sneaking onto my property with a giant roll of stickers? Karen. I peeled the sticker off, smirked at the camera, and muttered, "Oh, Karen, you are really asking for it." But before I could even confront her, she pulled her next stunt. It started with a city zoning violation. An official-looking letter from the Fairview City Code Enforcement Office landed in my mailbox, informing me that I was operating a commercial business from a residential property. I nearly spit out my coffee. Being a cop is a business now? I was about to laugh it off when another letter arrived, a noise complaint. Apparently, I had been using my sirens excessively, which was news to me, considering I never turned them on in the neighborhood. And then, one more. A zoning infraction. For my fence. Apparently it was too tall, by 1 inch. The message was clear. Karen had weaponized city bureaucracy. She was filing anonymous complaints, hoping that by drowning me in legal headaches, she could force me to comply with her imaginary HOA rules. Unfortunately for her, she had just made one massive mistake. She left a paper trail. So I did what any good cop would do. I filed public records requests with the city. And what do you know? Every single complaint was filed by the same person. And guess whose handwriting matched the violation notices she had left on my car? Karen. She was busted. And I was going to make sure everyone knew it. The next HOA meeting was packed. Karen had clearly stacked the room with her loyalists. Smug-looking retirees and power-hungry suburbanites, all ready to back her up as she made her case against me. She stood at the front, her HOA rulebook in hand, tapping her nails against the cover like some kind of courtroom drama villain. "Before we begin," she said, "we need to discuss a pressing issue. Officer Carter's continuous violations of HOA policies have gone unchecked for too long. It is time we take action." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I stood up. "Actually," I said, "I'd like to address that." Karen narrowed her eyes. "There's nothing to address. You're in violation. I pulled out my folder. "Oh no, Karen," I said. "There's plenty to address." I flipped open the documents. The room went silent. "You see," I continued, "I did a little digging, and it turns out someone has been filing fraudulent complaints against me with the city." Karen's lips parted. I held up the letters. "And wouldn't you know it, the handwriting matches the notices you've been leaving on my car." A hush fell over the room. Karen's face twitched. What are you implying?" I smirked. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. You've been harassing a police officer, filing false reports. And guess what? That's a crime." Gasps. A few of Karen's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others started looking at her instead of me. "You vandalized my property," I said, flipping to the security footage stills. "You filed fake noise complaints. You even got city officials involved with bogus zoning violations." Karen was visibly sweating. "And then I went in for the kill." "So here's the deal," I said, crossing my arms. "Either you drop this whole thing right now, or I report all of this to the city attorney and have you charged with harassment, falsifying complaints, and trespassing." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But no words came out, because for the first time she had no way out. I had barely finished my coffee the next morning when I heard it. A low rumbling, the unmistakable sound of a tow truck. I frowned and walked to the window. There, rolling up in front of my house, was a flatbed tow truck. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to have the worst day of his career. I watched as he walked straight to my police cruiser, hooked up a chain, and started preparing to tow a government vehicle. For a solid 3 seconds, I just stood there, blinking. Karen. It had to be Karen. And if she had just sent a tow truck to steal my police vehicle, she had officially crossed from petty HOA tyrant into actual criminal territory. I stepped outside, arms crossed, and cleared my throat. The driver jumped and spun around. Morning, sir," he stammered. I nodded at my car. "Mind telling me what the hell you're doing?" The guy swallowed. "I got an order from the HOA to tow this vehicle. Non-compliant residential property infraction." He said it like it was an actual legal term, like he believed it. I raised an eyebrow. "You got paperwork for that?" He nodded quickly and shoved a form into my hands. I glanced at it. Sure enough, at the bottom of the page, scrawled in smug, cursive handwriting. Signed, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. I exhaled slowly. "All right," I said. "Couple of things. First off, this is a government vehicle." The driver hesitated. "Oh." "Second," I continued, "you understand that towing a police cruiser, without legal authorization, counts as grand theft auto, right?" His face paled. Wait, what?" I nodded. "And third? Karen has zero legal authority over my property, which means that the second you attach that winch, you are committing a felony." His eyes darted to his truck. I smirked. "How about we call Karen? Right now." Speakerphone. The driver, now sweating, frantically pulled out his phone and dialed. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then, "What is it?" Karen's voice. The driver fumbled. Ma'am, we have a problem. The car you asked me to tow belongs to a, police officer." A beat of silence. Then Karen scoffed. "I don't care if he's a cop. Tow the damn car." I grinned. The driver looked at me, his hands shaking. I nodded. "Put her on speaker." The guy hesitated, but my very unimpressed cop face must have done the trick, because he tapped the button. "I don't care who he is," Karen was still screeching. "He needs to learn that the HOA has rules, and he doesn't get special treatment just because he thinks he's above the law. I leaned in. Hey, Karen. Silence. A long silence. Then, click. Karen had just hung up. The driver gulped. You unhook my car, I said, and drive away right now, and I won't arrest you for attempted felony auto theft. I didn't have to tell him twice. He practically sprinted to the truck, yanked the chains off, and peeled out of the neighborhood like the road was on fire. And just like that, Karen had officially committed a crime. An hour later, my phone rang. It was my precinct commander. Carter, he said, his voice already exhausted. I just got a report that an HOA tried to steal a police vehicle. I grinned. Oh yeah, I can explain that. I did. By the time I finished, there was a long pause. Jesus Christ, the commander muttered. All right, consider this handled. I'm sending a unit to have a friendly little chat with your lovely HOA president. And that's how, an hour later, 2 uniformed officers pulled up in front of Karen's house. I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching the show. Karen opened the door, saw the cops, and froze. One of the officers crossed his arms. Mrs. Whitmore, we need to talk about an incident involving an illegal towing order. Karen's mouth flapped open and closed. I don't know what you're talking about. The officer sighed. Well, that's funny because we have a recorded phone call where you explicitly tell the tow driver to steal a police vehicle. Karen turned bright red. This is harassment. The officer ignored her. Since this is a first-time offense, we're issuing an official warning. But if you ever attempt to illegally remove a vehicle again, we will charge you. Karen twitched. Her whole body went stiff, like a broken wind-up doll. And then, in true Karen fashion, she pointed directly at me. He's abusing his power, she shrieked. You're all in on it. This is a conspiracy. The officers exchanged a glance. Then, one of them calmly pulled out a citation book. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, since you're refusing to cooperate, we'll be issuing a formal citation for filing a false police report as well. Karen's entire body sagged. The neighborhood was dead silent. Slowly, heads started peeking out from doors, blinds were shifting, people were watching. Even Karen's loyalists had started inching away from her. This question mark. This was rock bottom. And that's when the final blow landed. That night, an emergency HOA meeting was held. Except this time, Karen wasn't leading it. A nervous-looking board member stood up. Due to overwhelming complaints and, legal issues, the board has unanimously voted to remove Karen Whitmore as HOA president. A hush fell over the room. Karen shot to her feet. You can't do this. Another board member sighed. Actually, per HOA bylaws, we can. And then the final nail in the coffin. We also reviewed the HOA's financial records, the board member continued. Karen froze. And it turns out, he said, flipping through a file, over the last 3 years there have been irregularities. HOA funds allocated to administrative fees that have no corresponding receipts. The room collectively gasped. Karen's face drained of color. That's ridiculous. Another board member, a woman named Linda, crossed her arms. Karen, you used HOA funds to pay for your landscaping. Someone actually screamed. Linda kept going. And you hired a contractor who only worked on your property. A neighbor muttered, Oh my God, she's been robbing us. Karen was trembling. This is a witch hunt. The board member ignored her. Because of these findings, the HOA will be pressing formal charges. Karen staggered back, like she'd been physically struck. I leaned forward, smirking. Wow, I said. You tried to fine me out of the neighborhood, And now you're about to get fined out of your own house. And just like that, the Queen of the HOA was dethroned. A few days after the HOA meeting, something strange happened. A for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. At first I thought it was a joke. Maybe one of the neighbors, still salty over years of Karen's tyranny, had planted it there as a prank. But no, Karen was really selling her house. I casually strolled over to my neighbor, Bob, an older guy who had always kept his head down when Karen was in power, but definitely wasn't a fan of hers. "She's selling?" I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. Bob smirked. "Oh, you didn't hear?" I raised an eyebrow. "The new HOA board hit her with so many fines that she couldn't fight back," he said, shaking his head in amusement. "Turns out all those administrative fees she was skimming from the HOA budget. She has to pay them back." I let out a low whistle. "How much are we talking?" Bob chuckled. "Enough to bankrupt her. The new board brought in a lawyer. She tried to fight it, but they shut her down hard." The irony of it was delicious. For years, Karen had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist. She fined people for mailboxes, for lawn decorations, for having the wrong shade of beige on their house. She had turned petty citations into a weapon, and now she was being taken down by her own rules. I could only imagine the absolute rage she must have felt when she realized that her own tactics had finally come back to bite her. Bob leaned in conspiratorially. "And get this," he said, his voice filled with glee. "She had to apply for an HOA violation waiver just to sell her house." I almost choked on my coffee. Karen, the woman who spent years holding this neighborhood hostage with her ridiculous rules, had to beg the HOA for permission to leave. I let out a long, satisfied sigh. "Bob," I said, "this might be the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Bob grinned. "Best part? She didn't get her full asking price. Nobody wants to buy a house that's been slapped with violations and legal disputes. She lost money just to get out." I smirked. Couldn't have happened to a nicer person. A week later, moving day arrived. Karen was out on her driveway, red-faced and furious, barking orders at the moving crew as they loaded her overpriced furniture into a moving truck. The entire neighborhood was outside, watching. Nobody said a word. Nobody helped. Nobody said goodbye. Karen stomped toward her car, her face a mask of barely contained fury. And I couldn't resist. As she passed my house, I gave her a slow, casual salute. Her eyes flashed with fury, but she didn't say a word. She got into her car, slammed the door, and sped off. And just like that, Fairview Estates was finally free. That weekend, the neighborhood threw a block party. Now, nobody explicitly said it was a Karen is gone celebration. But let's be real. The moment she left, it was like a dark cloud lifted. No more nasty emails. No more fake fines. No more petty threats about people's Christmas lights being too bright. I was sitting in a lawn chair, enjoying a beer, when Linda, the new HOA board member, walked over. "Officer Carter," she said with a grin. "I have to admit, I never thought I'd see the day." I raised my bottle in a toast. "You and me both." Bob snorted. "I still can't believe she fined herself out of the neighborhood." I smirked. I told her to stop harassing me, but she just couldn't help herself. The group laughed. And just when I thought the drama was finally over, a black SUV pulled up in front of Karen's old house. The neighbors fell silent. A man in a sharp business suit stepped out, followed by a real estate agent. Linda squinted. "Wait, is that—" Bob's jaw dropped. "No freaking way." I folded my arms, watching as the man inspected the property with a calculating look. Then it clicked. The new buyer wasn't just anyone. He was the president of the city's police union. I broke into a huge grin. Oh, this was about to get so much better. By the next week, it was official. Karen's old house had been purchased by none other than Chief David Reynolds, my police commander. The neighborhood exploded with gossip. I heard he's moving in his whole family. Does this mean we're going to have 2 cops on the block now? This is too good. I was sitting on my porch when Reynolds himself walked over, beer in hand. Carter, he said, taking a sip. I got the full story about Karen. I smirked. Oh yeah? Oh yeah, he chuckled. I read every HOA violation she ever filed against you. Hell, I think half the precinct knows about it now. I laughed. So you just happened to buy her house? Reynolds shrugged. Let's just say I love a good deal. The bank foreclosed on her before she could finish fighting the HOA fines. I picked it up for dirt cheap. I shook my head. That's poetic justice. Reynolds grinned. And it gets better. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. He leaned in. Guess what? What? The new HOA board has elections coming up. I grinned. You don't say. Reynolds nodded. And I just ran for HOA president. I nearly spit out my drink. You're kidding. He shook his head. Election is next week. And guess what? What? I'm running unopposed. I threw my head back and howled with laughter. Karen had spent years turning this neighborhood into a nightmare. And now? Now the new HOA president was a police commander. I wiped a tear from my eye. So, what's the first thing you're going to do? Reynolds took a dramatic sip of his beer. First, he said, I'm getting rid of all the stupid parking restrictions. I smirked. And after that, he grinned. I'm making sure Karen is banned from ever moving back. I burst out laughing. Now that's a rule I can get behind. 3 weeks later, I was outside watering my lawn when I heard a familiar, furious voice. You think you've won, but you haven't. I turned. Karen, standing at the edge of the neighborhood, red-faced, disheveled, and absolutely unhinged. She was screaming. I sighed. Karen, what are you doing here? She stormed up, waving a legal document. I filed an appeal, she shrieked. I still have rights. Before I could respond, Reynolds opened his front door. He took one look at Karen and sighed. Karen, he said, voice calm. You don't live here anymore. Karen's eye twitched. I have rights. Reynolds smirked. Yeah, well, I have a trespassing law. Karen froze. You step on this property again, Reynolds said, holding up his phone, and I'll have actual police officers remove you. Karen's face turned red. She stammered, sputtered, then spun on her heels, stomped back to her car, and sped off. Forever. And just like that, Fairview Estates was finally free.